I was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. My son said, "Time to take the keys and the control." He changed my locks, threw away my journals, and erased my memories, one item at a time. But he forgot one thing: I was still his mother. And mothers remember, if not with mind then with heart. When they finally listened to mine, his version didn't stand a chance. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at my car keys dangling from Nick's fingers, when I realized my own son had just stolen my freedom. Not borrowed. Not temporarily taken. Stolen. "Mom, you nearly drove through Mrs. Patterson's fence yesterday," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd been hearing more often lately. "The keys stay with me now." But that wasn't true. I remembered yesterday perfectly. I'd backed out of my driveway, noticed Mrs. Patterson waving from her garden, and drove to the grocery store without incident. The fence story was fabricated and we both knew it. My name is Sydney Hartwell, and 3 weeks ago, everything changed with 4 words from Dr. Morrison: early-stage cognitive decline. Not the full dementia sentence I'd feared, but enough to crack open the foundation of my carefully constructed life. I was 67, a retired English teacher who'd spent 42 years molding young minds, and suddenly I felt like clay in someone else's hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd taught thousands of students to question everything, to read between the lines, to recognize manipulation in literature. Yet here I stood, watching my 38-year-old son manipulate the narrative of my own life with surgical precision. "Nick, I don't need," I began, but Allison's perfectly manicured hand touched his shoulder, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Sydney, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "Nick's just looking out for you. We both are." The way she said "we" made my stomach clench. They'd been married only 8 months, and already she spoke as if she'd earned the right to make decisions about my life. I studied my son's face, searching for the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried in my arms when his father died, who'd called me his best friend during his college graduation speech. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger wearing expensive clothes I couldn't afford on my teacher's pension. "Where are my photo albums?" I asked suddenly, remembering how I'd searched for them that morning. I wanted to show my neighbor the pictures from Nick's wedding, the ones where he actually smiled instead of checking his phone. Nick and Allison exchanged a look. One of those married couple telepathic conversations that excluded everyone else in the room. "You put them somewhere safe, remember?" Nick said. "You've been misplacing things lately." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I doubted myself. Had I moved them? The uncertainty felt like quicksand beneath my feet. "I want to call Dr. Morrison," I said, reaching for the phone. "I want to understand exactly what he told you about my condition." "Mom, you were there. You heard everything he said." Nick's patience was thinning, revealing something harder underneath. Early-stage dementia. Memory issues. Potential safety concerns. He said cognitive decline, not dementia, I corrected, surprised by the steel in my own voice. Allison laughed. A sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Sweetie, those are just different words for the same thing." But they weren't. I'd spent my entire career understanding the power of precise language, the difference between suggest and insist, between possible and probable. Dr. Morrison had been careful with his words, explaining that my symptoms were mild, that many people lived independently for years with similar conditions. The realization hit me like ice water. They weren't protecting me. They were positioning me. I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden where I'd spent the morning planting tomatoes. My hands were still dirty from the soil, my back ached pleasantly from the work, and my mind felt sharp as a blade. Whatever was happening to my memory, I wasn't helpless. Not yet. "I'm making coffee," I announced, moving toward the cabinet where I kept my good cups, the ones Caleb had given me for our 20th anniversary. The cabinet was empty. "Where are my dishes?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "We put them somewhere safer," Allison said quickly. "You know, in case you drop them." My hands weren't shaking. My reflexes were fine. I'd never dropped those cups in 27 years of marriage or 15 years of widowhood. But somehow, in the 3 weeks since my diagnosis, I'd apparently become too fragile to handle my own belongings. I turned around slowly, studying their faces. Nick looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. Allison wore that same half-smile I was beginning to recognize. the expression of someone winning a game the other person didn't know they were playing. "I want you both to leave," I said quietly. "Mom, don't be ridiculous," Nick said, but his voice cracked slightly. "We're trying to help you." "Help me what?" "Disappear." The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see Nick wrestling with something, guilt maybe, or the remnants of the love we'd once shared. For a moment I thought I saw my real son flickering behind his eyes. Then Allison stepped closer to him, her presence like a shadow swallowing light. "Sydney, you're getting confused again," she said, her voice gentle as a knife between ribs. "Why don't you rest? We'll finish organizing things while you nap." Organizing. The euphemism made my teeth ache. I looked at Nick one more time, really looked at him, memorizing his face. Not because I might forget it due to my condition, but because I had the terrible feeling that the son I'd raised, the one who'd held my hand at his father's funeral, who'd thanked me for never giving up in his high school yearbook, might already be gone. "Get out," I said, each word clear as crystal. "Both of you. Now." They left, but I heard Nick's key turning in the lock from outside. A lock I'd apparently forgotten he had duplicates made for, though I couldn't remember giving permission for that either. Standing alone in my kitchen, I realized that my diagnosis hadn't shaken my world. My son had. The silence after they left felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm. I walked through rooms that had sheltered me for 32 years and nothing felt familiar anymore. The walls held the same paint, the floors creaked in the same places, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was a stage, and I was performing the role of a declining woman for an audience I never auditioned for. 3 days passed before I heard Nick's key again. I was reading in my favorite armchair, the burgundy one Caleb had surprised me with after my first year of teaching, when the front door opened without a knock. The casual invasion made my chest tighten. "Morning, Mom," Nick called, his voice artificially cheerful. Behind him, Allison carried a clipboard and wore the expression of someone conducting a home inspection. "We brought groceries," she announced, heading straight for my kitchen. I heard her opening cabinets, rearranging things with the confidence of ownership. I followed them, watching as Nick installed something on my landline phone. A small black device I didn't recognize. "What is that?" I asked. "Call monitoring," he said without looking up. "So we know if you're getting those scam calls that target elderly people." Elderly. The word stung more than it should have. Yesterday I'd solved the Sunday crossword in record time. This morning I'd balanced my checkbook to the penny. But suddenly I was elderly, vulnerable, incapable of recognizing a telephone scammer. "I've been managing my own calls for 67 years, I said. "Times change, Mom." Nick's tone suggested the conversation was over. Allison emerged from the kitchen, checking items off her clipboard. "Sydney, we need to discuss your spending habits. $300 at the bookstore last month? That seems excessive." The bookstore. Where I'd bought gifts for my former students' graduations, where I'd purchased the mystery novels that kept my mind sharp, where I'd found the poetry collection that reminded me of Caleb's favorite verses. Each purchase had been deliberate, meaningful. "Those were gifts," I explained. "For people who barely remember you exist," Allison said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "We've set up automatic bill pay and a weekly allowance. Much simpler. An allowance. Like I was 12 years old again, asking my father for spending money. That evening I tried calling my friend Martha. The phone made strange clicking sounds before connecting. "Sydney, you sound far away," Martha said. "The connection's been odd lately," I replied, then caught myself glancing toward the black device. "How's your garden?" We talked for 20 minutes about safe topics. Weather, neighborhood gossip, her grandson's soccer games. But when I mentioned feeling isolated, the line went quiet for a moment. "Are you all right, dear?" Martha asked. Before I could answer, I heard another click. The call ended abruptly. When I tried calling back, a recorded message played. "This number has been temporarily restricted. Please contact your service provider." My hands shook as I set down the receiver. They were screening my calls now, deciding who deserved access to my voice. The next morning brought new revelations. My credit cards were temporarily suspended for security purposes. My checkbook had mysteriously vanished from the kitchen drawer where I'd kept it for decades. Even my spare car keys, the ones I'd hidden in the flower pot by the front door, were gone. "We're just streamlining things," Nick explained when I confronted him. Making your life easier. But nothing felt easier. Everything felt impossible. I stood at my bedroom window, watching Mrs. Patterson tend her roses across the street. She waved and I waved back, wondering if she could see the prisoner behind the glass. That's when I heard them talking downstairs. Their voices carried up through the old heating vents. A quirk of this house that had once allowed me to know when teenage Nick was sneaking in past curfew. By the end of summer, Allison was saying. The lawyer said once she's deemed incompetent, the power of attorney transfer will be automatic. What if she fights it? Nick's voice, smaller, uncertain. She won't. Look at her, she's already questioning herself. A few more weeks of this and she'll be begging us to take over. I sank onto my bed, the words hitting me like physical blows. End of summer. They had a timeline. A plan. I wasn't just losing my independence, I was being systematically dismantled. The heartbreak wasn't in losing control of my bank account or my telephone. It was in realizing that my son, the boy I'd raised to value honesty, kindness, and respect, saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. Not his mother. Not the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. Just a liability to be managed until I could be disposed of. Over the following days I tested myself constantly. Did I remember to take my vitamins? Yes. Could I recall what I'd eaten for breakfast? Scrambled eggs with cheese, wheat toast, coffee with cream. Was I forgetting appointments? No, because I wasn't allowed to make any. But whenever Nick visited, I found myself stumbling over words, losing track of thoughts mid-sentence. The stress of performance was creating the very symptoms they claimed to be protecting me from. See, Nick would say gently, that pitying look in his eyes. It's getting worse, Mom. And I'd begun to believe him. Until I climbed into the attic one afternoon, searching for photo albums I knew they hadn't found yet. Behind a box of Christmas decorations, my fingers brushed against something familiar. Caleb's old voice recorder. The one he'd used for recording lesson plans when he was studying to become a substitute teacher after his retirement. I held the small device in my hands, remembering how Caleb had always said, "Words have power, Sydney. When you can't trust your memory, trust your voice." That night, after the house settled into darkness, I pressed record for the first time. "My name is Sydney Hartwell," I whispered. "Today is June 15th. I'm not confused. I am not incompetent. And I am being systematically erased by my own son." My voice was steady, clear, undeniably lucid. My memory might fail me eventually, but my voice would remember everything. Recording became my ritual. Every morning at dawn, before the house stirred with unwelcome visitors, I whispered my truths into Caleb's old device. Day 3, Nick removed all my address books. Day 7, Allison took my prescription bottles to organize them. Day 12, they're installing security cameras. For my safety, they claim. But on day 15, everything changed when I heard Martha's voice through my bedroom window. "Sydney. Sydney, are you home?" she called from the front yard, her familiar voice cutting through the morning quiet like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I rushed downstairs, forgetting caution, desperate for connection with someone who remembered who I used to be. But when I reached for the front door handle, it wouldn't turn. A new deadbolt had appeared overnight, one that required a key from both sides. "Martha." I called through the closed door, pressing my palm against the wood. "I can't, the lock is." "What do you mean you can't open it?" Her voice carried concern, not judgment. Through the window, I could see her standing on my porch, wearing the purple cardigan I'd knitted her last Christmas. Her silver hair caught the morning light, and her face showed the same sharp intelligence that had helped her navigate 40 years as a family court judge before retirement. "They changed the locks," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay composed. Martha's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, more dangerous. She walked around to my kitchen window where we'd shared countless cups of coffee over the decades. "Who changed them, Sydney?" "Nick and Allison. They say it's for my protection, but you're locked inside your own home." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades recognizing abuse in all its forms. I nodded, tears threatening. "Martha, I need to tell you something. Can you come back tonight? Around 10? They usually leave by then." Her eyes narrowed with understanding. "I'll be here." That evening, I watched from my dark living room until Martha's car pulled into my driveway. I'd unlocked the window earlier, praying they hadn't secured those too. The kitchen window slid open with a soft scrape, and Martha climbed through with surprising agility for a 71-year-old woman. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she whispered, brushing dirt from her slacks. "Sneaking into my best friend's house like teenagers." I handed her the voice recorder without explanation. Her face grew graver with each passing minute as she listened to my documented evidence. When my recorded voice described overhearing their timeline for taking control, Martha's hands clenched into fists. "Those calculating little," she caught herself, remembering her manners even in outrage. "Sydney, this is elder abuse. Financial exploitation. But what if they're right? What if I am losing my mind?" Martha gripped my shoulders, forcing me to meet her eyes. The woman who just orchestrated this secret meeting, who's been systematically documenting evidence for weeks, who solved last Sunday's crossword puzzle in 15 minutes. That woman is not losing her mind. She stayed until midnight and we formed our plan. Martha would mail a cassette tape to her nephew David, who worked in elder law. Meanwhile, she'd contact Robert Chin, Caleb's former attorney, the one who'd helped us draft our wills years ago. "But first," she said, "we need concrete proof of what they're doing financially." The next morning, I attempted something I hadn't done in weeks. I tried to access my online banking. The computer showed an error message. "Account access temporarily restricted. Please contact your branch." My checking account, which I'd managed independently for 42 years, was now controlled by someone else. Martha arrived the following afternoon during Nick's usual absence, armed with information that made my blood run cold. "Robert did some digging," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Sydney, they've already submitted paperwork to add Allison as a joint owner on your checking account. They've contacted a real estate agent about listing this house." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. "Without my signature? They're using a preliminary power of attorney document. One that shouldn't be valid yet because you haven't been declared incompetent. But they're betting no one will check too closely." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. Not only were they stealing my present, they were erasing my future. "There's more," Martha continued gently. "They've scheduled you for another medical evaluation next week. With a doctor who specializes in dementia assessments. Robert thinks they're shopping for a diagnosis." My stomach dropped. They were manufacturing the evidence they needed to justify their theft. "What do we do?" Martha smiled, the same fierce expression she'd worn in courtrooms when defending vulnerable families. "We beat them at their own game. Robert's arranging for you to see Dr. Elizabeth Warner tomorrow. She's one of the most respected neurologists in the state, and she's testified in elder abuse cases before." The next day, Martha drove me to Dr. Warner's office in her ancient Honda, taking back roads to avoid any possibility of being followed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sneaking around to prove my own competency. Dr. Warner was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and direct questions. She spent 3 hours with me, conducting memory tests, cognitive assessments, and detailed interviews about my daily functioning. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said finally, "you show signs of mild cognitive decline, which is normal for someone your age. Your memory has some gaps, but your reasoning, judgment, and decision-making abilities are completely intact. You are absolutely competent to manage your own affairs." I nearly cried with relief. Not because the news was surprising, but because finally someone with authority was confirming what I'd known all along. Martha squeezed my hand as Dr. Warner continued. "I'm also required to tell you that what you've described, family members restricting your access to your own finances and property without legal authority, constitutes financial abuse under state law." We left the office with official documentation of my competency and Dr. Warner's detailed report. But more importantly, we left with validation that my instincts had been correct. "Now what?" I asked as Martha drove us home. "Now we gather everything we have and let Robert work his magic," she said. "But Sydney, you need to understand, this might get ugly. Nick is going to fight back when he realizes his plan is falling apart." I thought about my son, about the gentle boy who'd once made me Mother's Day cards from construction paper and glue. Then I thought about the man who'd locked me in my own home and plotted to steal my life's work. "I'm not fighting for money," I said quietly. "I'm fighting for my dignity." Martha nodded. "Then we'll make sure you win both." Robert Chin moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years defending people's rights. Within a week of our meeting, papers were filed, and suddenly Nick found himself on the receiving end of legal documents he hadn't expected. "Mom, what is this?" His voice cracked over the phone when the court summons arrived. For the first time in months, he sounded like the uncertain boy I remembered. "It's me taking back my life," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. The silence stretched between us before he spoke again, his tone shifting to something colder. "You're making a mistake. We're trying to help you, and you're listening to that meddling old woman instead of your own family." That meddling old woman was currently in my kitchen, helping me organize the evidence we'd gathered. Martha looked up from her neat stacks of documents when I hung up the phone. "How did he sound?" she asked. "Scared." The realization gave me no satisfaction. And angry. 2 days later, Nick arrived with his own lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Bradley Winters who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate law firm's advertisement. They sat across from Robert Chin in a sterile conference room, trying to negotiate a settlement that would avoid court entirely. "Mrs. Hartwell clearly needs assistance managing her affairs," Winters said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating elderly clients. "My client is simply trying to ensure his mother's well-being." Robert slid a folder across the table. "Your client has been systematically isolating his mother, restricting her access to her own property, and attempting to gain control of her assets without proper legal authority. We have documentation." I watched Nick's face as Robert outlined our evidence. The color drained from his cheeks when Robert mentioned the recorded conversations, and his hands clenched when Martha's testimony was discussed. "This is ridiculous," Allison interjected, speaking for the first time. "Sydney's condition is deteriorating. We've seen it firsthand." "Have you?" Robert asked mildly. "Because Dr. Warner's comprehensive evaluation suggests otherwise." That's when I knew we were going to court. Nick's jaw tightened with stubborn determination, the same expression he'd worn as a child when he'd been caught in a lie but refused to admit it. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare. Those 21 days felt like living in a war zone. Nick and Allison increased their visits, documenting every moment I hesitated to find a word, every time I misplaced my reading glasses. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Allison said during one particularly tense visit. "We're not the enemy here." But they were treating me like one. The house felt under siege, every conversation recorded by hidden devices they thought I hadn't noticed, every interaction designed to provoke the confusion they needed to prove their case. Martha practically moved in during those final weeks, helping me practice my testimony and keeping me grounded when anxiety threatened to overwhelm my clarity. "Remember," she said the night before the hearing, "you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every parent who's ever been betrayed by the child they raised." The morning of the hearing arrived gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself reflected the somber nature of what was about to unfold. I wore my navy blue dress, the one Caleb had always said made me look distinguished, and carried the small leather purse that held my voice recorder. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but the weight of what would be decided there made it feel enormous. Judge Patricia Holloway presided, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Nick and Allison sat at one table with their lawyer, while Martha, Robert, and I occupied the other. When I caught Nick's eye, he looked away quickly, but not before I saw something that might have been shame. Winters presented their case first, painting a picture of a confused, declining woman who could no longer manage basic tasks. He submitted evidence of my erratic behavior, my attempts to access my own bank account, my paranoid concerns about missing belongings, my inappropriate friendship with Martha. "Mrs. Hartwell requires protection from herself," he concluded, "and from those who would take advantage of her vulnerability." The irony of that statement hung heavy in the air. Then it was Robert's turn. He called Dr. Warner first, who testified about my cognitive abilities with clinical precision. Her words carried weight, but it was the recordings that changed everything. When Robert played the first tape, my clear, articulate voice describing the systematic removal of my belongings, I watched the judge's expression shift. But it was the second recording that sealed our case. Allison's voice, captured through those old heating vents, discussing their timeline for gaining control. If we play this right, we'll have everything signed over by the end of summer. Her recorded voice filled the courtroom. Nick's face went white. Allison stared straight ahead, her composure cracking for the first time. She's manipulating you. Nick suddenly shouted, standing up despite his lawyer's restraining hand. She's playing the victim, but she's the one who's sick. Judge Holloway's gavel came down once, sharp and final. Mr. Carter, you will sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed from my courtroom. The judge's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen every form of family dysfunction imaginable. No, Mr. Carter. After listening to these recordings and reviewing the evidence, it appears your mother remembers quite a bit more than you assumed she would. When the judge delivered her decision, the words seemed to echo in the stunned silence. Guardianship petition denied. However, given the concerning pattern of behavior demonstrated by the petitioner and his spouse, this court is establishing a protective trust to ensure Mrs. Hartwell's assets remain secure while providing appropriate support for her continued independence. Allison was the first to leave, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor, her dreams of redecorating my home evaporating with each step. She didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, just walked out of the courtroom and, as I would later learn, out of Nick's life entirely. But Nick remained, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, betrayal, perhaps even a grudging respect. Why would you do this to me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for a moment I saw both the man who'd tried to steal my life and the boy I'd raised with such hope. Because I may forget your face one day, I said quietly, but I'll never forget what you tried to do to me. The truth hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Nick walked out of that courtroom without looking back, and I felt something inside me shift. Not break, but transform. The bridge between us might be damaged, but I was still standing and I had work to do. The first task was reclaiming what had been stolen. Robert Chin accompanied me to my bank the following Monday, where we discovered the extent of their attempted theft. The branch manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, looked genuinely horrified as she scrolled through the unauthorized access attempts. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm so sorry this happened, she said, printing out statements that showed the breadth of their manipulation. We've restored full access to all your accounts and implemented additional security measures. But I wasn't interested in security measures anymore. I was interested in purpose. That afternoon, Martha and I sat in Robert's office as he spread new documents across his mahogany desk. Your will, trust, and medical directives, he said. Clean slate. Who would you like as beneficiaries? I stared at the blank spaces where Nick's name would have been, feeling an unexpected sense of freedom rather than loss. I want to create something that matters, I said. An education fund for children who need opportunities. The Caleb and Sydney Hartwell Educational Foundation, Martha suggested softly. The name felt right, honoring the man who'd believed education could change the world and the woman who'd spent 4 decades proving him correct. Within 2 weeks, the foundation was established. Robert helped me craft the mission statement, providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, because every young mind deserves the chance to flourish. The irony wasn't lost on me. The son who'd tried to steal my assets had inadvertently inspired me to give them away to children who would truly appreciate the gift of learning. Martha arrived one morning carrying 3 cardboard boxes I hadn't seen in months. Your journals, she announced, setting them on my kitchen table. I may have rescued a few things during those early weeks when items kept disappearing. I opened the top box with trembling hands. Inside were notebooks spanning 30 years. My thoughts on teaching, reflections on raising Nick, memories of Caleb, observations about life and literature. My voice, preserved in ink and paper. You saved them, I whispered. I had a feeling they might be important someday, Martha said with a knowing smile. As I flipped through pages of my own handwriting, an idea began forming. These weren't just personal memories. They were documentation of a woman's life, proof that age doesn't diminish worth. Evidence that mothers remember even when the world tries to erase them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell at the Regional Memory Care Clinic was fascinated when I contacted her about donating copies of my journals. Mrs. Hartwell, these could be invaluable for families dealing with similar situations, she said during our meeting. We see financial abuse of elderly parents more often than people realize, but we rarely have such detailed documentation of the emotional manipulation involved. I spent the next month working with Dr. Mitchell to identify the most relevant passages. Moments when I'd question my own sanity, instances where I'd documented the gradual erosion of my autonomy, reflections on the difference between genuine care and controlling behavior. This entry particularly struck me, Dr. Mitchell said, reading from my journal dated 3 weeks before the court hearing. You wrote, "Today I remembered that love doesn't require surrender of self. Protection doesn't demand isolation. Care doesn't justify control." These distinctions could help other families recognize unhealthy dynamics. The journal project led to speaking engagements. Dr. Mitchell invited me to address support groups for caregivers and family members of people with cognitive decline. Standing before these audiences sharing my story, I discovered something unexpected. I wasn't the only mother who'd been silenced in the name of protection. Eleanor Walsh, 73, approached me after one such talk. "My daughter took my credit cards last year," she said quietly. She said it was because I was buying too many gifts for my grandchildren. But those gifts were the only way I felt connected to them anymore. Her story echoed dozens of others I heard. Adult children making unilateral decisions about their parents' lives, using medical concerns as justification for control, gradually stripping away independence under the guise of care. "We need to do something," Eleanor said. "People need to know this happens." That conversation sparked my next project. I'd taught thousands of students to find their voices through writing. Now I needed to find mine again. Learning voice dictation software at 67 proved challenging, but Martha patiently helped me navigate the technology. My fingers might occasionally betray me, forgetting words or stumbling over keys, but my voice remained strong. Chapter 1. I spoke into the computer microphone. My name is Sydney Hartwell, and this is the story of how I learned the difference between forgetting and being forgotten. The book grew organically, weaving together my personal experience with the stories shared by other women I'd met. Not just my journey, but our collective voice. Mothers, wives, teachers, professionals who'd been reduced to nothing more than problems to be managed. The writing process revealed memories I'd thought were lost. Details that emerged with surprising clarity when I stopped fighting to remember and simply let the stories flow. I wrote about Caleb's patient encouragement of my teaching career, about Nick's childhood sweetness, about the moment I realized I was stronger than my diagnosis suggested. Remembering Me, a mother's memoir, took 8 months to complete. Martha served as my unofficial editor, helping me organize chapters and refine passages that felt unclear. "This section about rebuilding your confidence after the hearing," she said one afternoon, pointing to a paragraph on her laptop screen. "It's powerful, but I think you could push deeper. What did it feel like to trust your own judgment again?" The book became more than memoir. It became a guide for other families navigating similar challenges, a testament to the reality that cognitive changes don't negate a person's fundamental worth or right to dignity. When the first printed copy arrived in the mail, I held it like the precious thing it was. My story, my voice, my legacy, transformed from private pain into public purpose. The dedication page read simply, "For every mother who remembers and for every family learning to listen." On the back cover, a familiar photo smiled up at me, Caleb and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful, surrounded by possibilities we never could have imagined. The same photo Nick had tried to erase now graced thousands of copies, ensuring our love story would outlast any attempt to rewrite it. I may not remember everything perfectly anymore, but I remembered what mattered. My worth wasn't diminished by my diagnosis, my voice deserved to be heard, and my legacy belonged to me to write. 6 months after my book was published, I was arranging flowers from my garden when I heard the familiar sound of Nick's car pulling into my driveway. But this time there was no second car door slamming, no sharp click of Allison's heels on the pavement. Just silence and then a single hesitant knock on my front door. I opened it to find my son standing alone on the porch where he'd once confidently marched in with keys and clipboards. Now he waited for permission to enter his childhood home. "Hello, Mom." His voice carried none of its former authority. He looked thinner, older, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there during the court proceedings. "Nick." I stepped aside, allowing him into the living room that had been restored to my vision rather than his sterile efficiency. He stood awkwardly near the couch, hands in his pockets, studying the family photos I'd replaced on the mantelpiece. Pictures of him at various ages, smiling and carefree before ambition and Allison had hardened his features. Allison left, he said abruptly, as if the words had been burning in his throat. 3 weeks ago. She said I failed. Said I was weak for letting you manipulate me. He laughed bitterly. Funny how she saw manipulation everywhere except in her own actions. I settled into my burgundy chair, the one I'd reclaimed after months of exile from my own comfort. And what do you see now? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a photo of the three of us. Him, Caleb and me, taken during his high school graduation. I see that I lost my mother long before you might lose your memory. The admission hung between us, raw and honest in a way Nick hadn't been in years. Why did you come here? I asked. To ask for forgiveness. His voice cracked slightly on the word forgiveness, making him sound like the uncertain boy who used to seek my comfort after nightmares. I studied his face, searching for the calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing there. Instead, I found something that might have been genuine remorse, though I wasn't sure I trusted my ability to distinguish between his real emotions and his performed ones anymore. Forgiveness doesn't come before truth, I said quietly. You erased me when I was still here, Nick. You buried me before I was gone. His shoulders sagged as if I'd struck him. I know that now. But I was scared, Mom. The diagnosis, it terrified me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you gradually, so I convinced myself I was protecting what was left. By stealing it? By controlling it. The honesty in his admission surprised us both. Allison made it seem logical, necessary. She said families who planned ahead were the smart ones. I thought about the woman who'd smiled her way through my systematic dismantling, who'd calculated my worth down to the summer timeline for my erasure. And now I understand that I didn't lose you to dementia. I lost you to my own cowardice. The words carried weight, but I wasn't ready to be moved by them. Trust, once shattered, couldn't be rebuilt with a single conversation, no matter how seemingly sincere. You can visit, I said finally. Once a month. Sunday afternoons. Hope flickered in his eyes. To talk? To rebuild? No. I cut him off gently but firmly. To watch. To see what you tried to destroy. His confusion was evident, but he nodded anyway, desperate for any connection I was willing to offer. The following Sunday he arrived to find my living room transformed into an informal classroom. 5 teenagers from the local community center sat cross-legged on cushions, notebooks in their laps, eyes bright with the particular intensity of young people discovering their own voices. Today we're talking about the power of personal narrative, I announced, settling into my teaching rhythm for the first time in years. How do we tell our own stories when the world tries to write us off? Nick took a seat in the back corner just as he had during parent-teacher conferences when he was proud of my work. But now he wasn't here as a supportive son. He was here as a witness to what he'd almost silenced. Jasmine, a 17-year-old with fierce intelligence and a scholarship to State University, raised her hand. Mrs. Hartwell, what happens when family members don't believe in your story? I glanced toward Nick before answering. Then you tell it louder with more clarity until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. During that session, I read aloud from one of Caleb's letters, written shortly after Nick's birth, describing his hopes for our son's future. I want him to understand that strength isn't about having power over others, Caleb had written. It's about lifting others up when they're vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room, especially Nick, whose face flushed with shame as the teenagers absorbed Caleb's wisdom. These monthly sessions became a ritual of sorts. I taught creative writing, shared stories from my decades in education, and read excerpts from Caleb's letters that painted a picture of the family we'd once been. The teenagers were hungry for these glimpses into authentic adulthood, these examples of how to love without controlling, how to care without consuming. Nick attended every session, growing quieter each time, shrinking into himself as he witnessed the respect and affection these young people showed me, the same respect he'd systematically dismantled. During one particularly moving session, Marcus, a quiet boy who'd never known his grandparents, asked me to read Caleb's letter about teaching Nick to ride a bicycle. Sydney held one side, I held the other. I read in Caleb's familiar cadence. But when Nick was ready to fly, we both had to let go. The hardest part of loving someone isn't holding on, it's knowing when to trust them to soar alone. The room fell silent. In the back corner I saw Nick wipe his eyes. After the teenagers left, he approached me with something that looked like desperation. "That letter," he said. "Dad wrote that about teaching me independence. And I used your diagnosis to take yours away." "Yes," I said simply. "You did. How do I fix this?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the calculating man who'd stolen my keys, but the lost boy who'd never learned to process his own fears without trying to control everything around him. "You don't fix it," I said. "You live with it. You carry the weight of what you did and you let it teach you something about the person you want to become." He nodded slowly, understanding perhaps for the first time that some mistakes don't get erased, they get integrated into who we are. As the months passed, I noticed changes in Nick during his visits. He stopped trying to justify his actions, stopped asking for absolution I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply listened, to the teenagers' stories, to Caleb's letters, to the sound of my voice growing stronger with each session. And in that listening, I began to see glimpses of the son I'd raised, the one who'd absorbed his father's lessons about lifting others up rather than holding them down. My memory might fade with time, but the warmth in my chest when I saw those young faces light up with possibility, that feeling would endure. That was where my true revenge lived. Not in punishing Nick, but in nurturing the exact opposite of what he'd tried to destroy. In showing him, and myself, that some legacies are too powerful to erase. If this story of a mother's quiet revenge had you hooked, hit that like button. My favorite part was when Sydney played those voice recordings in court and Nick's face went white. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and resilience.